Hello, and welcome to the second of two lectures on American imperial expansion from the turn of the century, sort of the 1900s, with the Spanish-American War. And we finished off with Americans winning that war, and now the debate within society of should they or should they not acquire those territories that they've got from Spain, and then what's going to be their policy towards the Caribbean and to Asia and China as well. And so they've taken Guam, Puerto Rico. Those are now become territories of the United States and continue to be territories of the United States. Guam, a Pacific island, and Puerto Rico, a Caribbean island. And Cuba is freed, but they're kind of freed, much like a teenage student is free. You're free to do whatever you want so long as your parents and guardians and teachers and principals all agree that you can do that. So quasi kind of a freedom. And we'll get to that shortly. And the Philippines, though, is the bigger question. They're so far away. They're so, just not like Americans. And what should be done with them? And should they be kept or not? And the argument is that if you leave them be, they're going to devolve into anarchy, that they won't be able to take care of themselves. Or that Germany or Japan could take them, and the United States would maybe be better off of taking them to prevent Japan or Germany from acquiring them. And arguments, why we should acquire them. Well, we need to convert them to Christianity, forgetting the fact that they are almost entirely Catholic, or to civilize them, whatever that means, and then the idea of trade and commerce as well. But we'll get back to the Philippines shortly. I want to look at the other places in Cuba. And when America declared war against Spain, an amendment was passed along with the declaration of war, known as the Teller Amendment. And this is the idealistic amendment. The idea that we have no territorial ambitions in Cuba. We're there to help American business interests and to help the Cuban revolutionaries free themselves, but we have no intention of colonizing and we're not going to take over. But then there's the Platt Amendment, which is the realistic amendment to the Cuban Constitution that gave the United States a sort of control over the island, that the United States has, say in Cuba's foreign policy to prevent Cuba from becoming into debt to a European power that might try to then seize territory. The United States has the right to interfere in Cuban affairs whenever they feel necessary. They've got hold of Guantanamo Bay. If you were curious of why America has a naval base on the island of Cuba today, it's from this. And Cuba will be basically a protector of the United States, and this is America's sphere of influence. And in Cuba and Latin America in general, Plattism becomes a derogatory phrase to sort of symbolize any sort of overarching, overbearing United States involvement in their affairs. Now, for Puerto Rico and Cuba, well, if Puerto Rico's going to become a territory of the United States, does that make Puerto Ricans and Filipinos, if they take that on, are they going to be citizens of the United States with all the legal benefits granted as such? And it came up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled no. And these are known as the insular cases. Now, the United States, having freed Cuba from Spain, has retained a level of control with the Platt Amendment, as we just saw. Now, for the Philippines, there's some questions that need to be, answered if they're going to take it on. Now, the Filipinos are expecting that the Americans are going to honor the Teller Amendment, that, going to war against Spain, they have no territorial desires. But McKinley decided that he's going to sign the treaty with Spain that will pass on the islands to the United States, and then leave it up to the Senate to ratify that treaty or not. And McKinley was making his argument that, it's responsibility of the United States to take on these people and turn them into Christians. And three questions. Does the United States have the right, duty to rule over other countries, and does this violate the principles on which the country is founded? Would the U.S. benefit economically from keeping the Philippines, or is it going to be a costly burden? And are they going to help contribute to the defense of the United States, or just create a burden that has to be funded by the taxpayers and possibly bring the United States into an Asian war with perhaps, say, Japan? And so it becomes a public debate, and there's imperialists and there's anti-imperialists, and the most prominent imperialists, one saying the United States should expand its empire, tended to be within the government already. Somebody like Theodore Roosevelt, vice president, but then when McKinley is shot, he'll become president of the United States, or senators who are making the arguments. And they are making arguments, for example, it's good for America to expand, the extension of the city on the hill. If you recall, the city on the hill was the expression that Jonathan Winthrop, an early leader of Massachusetts colony, said that America is destined to lead, and to lead by example, and a role model for the rest of the world. And this continued on with Manifest Destiny, and so the imperialists are just sort of making this extension here. Or it's the responsibility of white Anglo-Saxons to civilize non-white Christians, and this is known as the white man's burden. Of course, racial views were very prevalent at this time, that white Anglo-Saxon race represented the best race. The need for a new frontier, a safety valve. Shortly before they acquired these territories, an historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, had written a very prominent and important history of the United States, where he argued that the frontier is what made America, and that the frontier also provided, a safety net for excess population or capital investment. But now the frontier is closed, and so there's a psychological sort of fear in the United States that they've lost this safety valve, and colonies can provide a new one. Social Darwinist ideas, and that competition between the nations, and that it's heating up, and America needs to step up and get in the game, and economic gains, and just that it's the American thing to do, to expand in this way and to extend freedom and democracy over to these places. Now, the anti-imperialists tended to be leaders like William Jennings Bryan of the Democratic Party, who'd lost to McKinley. Mark Twain was a very prominent anti-imperialist, and they were arguing that this is dishonorable, that it's against American values of self-determination, republicanism, and go back to anti-colonialism, fighting off the British. That's the American thing to do. And that it violates the natural rights of Filipinos, it'll be costly, suck America into Asian affairs, and add non-Americans into the country. Non-white people are now going to become Americans. It's going to hurt labor by creating a large labor pool that'll compete with American labor, and just that it's the un-American thing to do. Now, arguments about overseas expansion generally tend to be framed in terms of who Americans were and what the United States stood for, whether or not you supported or opposed expansionism and imperialism. It comes down to identity and which, what you think America's mission is. And we've got two competing sort of identities going on here. Now, Senate does choose to retain the Philippine territory. It was a close vote. It wasn't sort of unanimous, and it sort of goes to show that that there are people in the United States whose vision is not always the one that's followed. We've got two competing different ones here, and we've got a couple cartoons here that shows it's going to be a burden, or we're going to lead by example. And what he's holding up there is the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba and others. And you notice in both of them, these places are symbolized by babies. They're children that, they're not grown up properly. Countries. And the idea that if you just left them, they wouldn't be able to take care of themselves is prevalent in sort of both of them. So they do take them, but this is going to lead to a very costly war in the Philippines. So the United States has gone from rescuing these Filipinos from the evil Spanish to now fighting them. And, they're now enemies of the United States. And if you think there's some irony in there, I think there is some irony in there. The Filipinos were surprised and disappointed and felt very badly deceived. And they're going to resist and resist quite fiercely using guerrilla tactics, and they're led by a man named Emilio Aguinaldo. And over 100,000 American soldiers sent, 4,000 would die. The fighting would go on for 3 years, and very vicious fighting. Filipinos using guerrilla warfare, the United States responding with all kinds of tactics, scorched earth sort of policy, concentration camps, search and destroy tactics, torture as well. The United States captured Aguinaldo, and the resistance sort of broke up, but it would continue on in a smaller scale for another 10 years, and it won't be until after World War II that the Filipinos are granted their independence. Now, this is going to lead to Hawaii being annexed as well. In the early 1800s, if we go back a little bit, Hawaii was just sort of used as a rest stop in the Pacific Ocean, and American missionaries were traveling there, coming out of the Second Great Awakening. And by the mid-1800s, sugar had really taken hold on the islands with Americans, and these Americans tended to be the children and grandchildren of the first missionaries. They'd set up large sugar plantations. They've got much of the land and wealth on the islands, and Asian workers were brought in to work on the plantations, and they outnumbered the native Hawaiians. By the 1890s, before the Spanish-American Wars, there was a lot of pressure from the owners of these plantations to have the United States annex Hawaii as a territory. And the planters wanted to avoid paying a tariff on their sugar, and that was their main motive. And they were arguing that a naval base at Pearl Harbor would very much benefit the United States, and it would benefit all sides. Now, the president, Cleveland, he rejected the idea of annexing Hawaii, but now the United States is going to make the decision, to annex Hawaii as a territory so that they can set up a naval base at Pearl Harbor and make it easier to protect their colony in the Philippines. And both of these are really just seen as a stepping stone to the real prize in Asia, the market of China and the resources of China. Now, China at this time is being sort of carved up into various spheres of influence by the major powers. The British having this big chunk here in Shanghai and up the Yangtze River, the French in the south, the Russians in the north, the Germans, and the Japanese. And the United States is sort of closed off from these markets. And they make a series of arguments that are known as the open door notes, or the open door policy, that they're concerned of being shut out from these large markets, and they argue that there should not be spheres of influence, but instead China should be opened up for all nations to trade freely. And this is where we get the idea of the open door. And other nations agreed, and China was not sort of partitioned off like Africa was. And but China herself, very weak at this time, going through a lot of problems internally, wasn't really consulted at all whether or not she wanted to be part of this. Okay, so we're going to come back to the Caribbean. And Roosevelt has become president of the United States. McKinley was shot, and Vice President Roosevelt assumed control. And he's going to add on to the Monroe Doctrine, what's known as a corollary, an add-on to it, which is the first part of the Monroe Doctrine: Europe, you stay out of Latin America and we'll stay out of there. But then the added part is to Latin America: you keep things stable and safe, or we will interfere in your nation to protect our interests. There he is. And we can see, and you can have a look at this map, or you can always just pause the screen to see all of the intervention that the United States has played in the Central America and the Caribbean and in South America as well. Quite a lot of intervention. And Nicaragua, Panama, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, all being sort of protectorates or quasi-protectorates of the United States, and Puerto Rico itself being a possession of the United States, as well as the Panama Canal being a possession. We'll get to that shortly. So this is the beginning of the idea of banana republics, where you have a powerful American corporate interest, for example, say United Fruit Company, working in tandem with a dictator to exploit the land and the peasants. And American capital would help finance the necessary infrastructure and initial investments, and the U.S. government largely stayed uninvolved unless it was necessary to put down, say, a peasant revolt. Later during the Cold War, Latin America will be a very hot region as the Soviet Union very actively sought influence in the region and tapped into Latin America's sort of anti-Americanism, with notable success in Cuba. However, American countermeasures led to brutal civil wars, assassinations, and the support for extreme right-wing dictators such as Augusto Pinochet of Chile. And some of the infrastructure and supporters of imperialism, British, American, Japanese, whatever, will often cite the investment and development of infrastructure and the modernizing of the colonies. And there's a truth in that, but it must be kept in mind that the development was done for the benefit of the economic interest. This railroad wasn't built for the benefit of the people of, say, Cuba. It's built for the benefit of the, United Fruit Company so that it can get its commodity out to market. So the Panama Canal is something that very much Roosevelt pushed, and Roosevelt's very responsible for getting it done. They want to, cut off travel time for military ships and commercial ships. And the French have been trying to build a route, but weren't very successful. Tropical diseases was playing havoc. And the United States bought a French company that go through Canal, and they negotiated with a company to build a Panama Canal. Panama was a province of Colombia. Talks break down, and the French company helped organize a rebellion. All of a sudden, hey, we got a rebellion in Panama, and U.S. provides support, and Panama is declared an independent country and recognizes an independent country, and as a United States protectorate, and United States and now this new independent country, they sign a treaty. U.S. pays $10 million for the canal zone that's now going to become their territory, and they go about building the Panama Canal. There's a picture of its construction. This was a massive engineering project, and took about 10 years to build. And the canal is a lock canal, meaning that you have to go into like a locked container, and then water is flooded in to raise you up, or if you're going the other way, water is sucked out to bring you down so you can reach the level of the next lock and move into the next lock, because the elevation gain on each side of the isthmus is different. This is different from, say, the Suez Canal, which is just a sea level canal, which you can just sail right through. And we're getting to the end. Roosevelt here on the world stage. Roosevelt, the mediator, negotiating peace between Russia and Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, and this actually soured the relationship with both of them, where they're both sort of like forced into a signing of a deal and didn't really feel they had much choice in it. You don't need to go into those details. And Roosevelt, the provocateur on the world stage, sent the great white American naval fleet on a grand tour to show, hey, we're here, and to demonstrate American capability, and sort of as a test of American capabilities is where there's the great white fleet. American ships were painted white. And so this is Roosevelt definitely the manifestation of his dream of America as a strong naval power. And after Roosevelt in Latin America and Asia, Taft would follow something called dollar diplomacy, of encouraging investment in these areas and thinking that money will lead to cooperation and stability. Wilson, what he called moral or missionary diplomacy, I will teach them to elect good people, not these sort of quasi-dictators. And then America, the idea that America can help export democracy. We see this in other periods as well. We're coming to Iraq to, help them and give them freedom. It's very paternalistic. We know best and do as we say, and soldiers will be sent in. And then later under FDR, what was called the good neighbor policy, and this is sort of an informal end to the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary. It's in the context of the 1930s, the Great Depression and the fascist dictators rising in Europe, and FDR sort of understanding that he might need Mexico and South America sort of on his side in future struggles there. So, a conclusion, we see some pillars of American foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine is, along with the Roosevelt Corollary, and wanting open access to trade. And that's still something today, as, a foundation of American foreign policy is access to markets. And were they imperialistic? Yes, policy towards the southern nature was an imperialistic policy, absolutely. But very few colonies. They didn't really exert direct control. It's more of an economic or political control. But it's still imperialistic. And finally, some just major assumptions of U.S. foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine will be upheld with the adding on the Roosevelt Corollary. The U.S. is standing tall. It's opened up access to markets in China and has spheres of influence in markets in Latin America. And coming back with Britain, sort of a rapprochement, as it's called, or friends again. And rapprochement is French for reapproach, realizing they have common interests and commonalities in a common political family. This exists still to this day, this solid relationship with Great Britain. Great Britain will be the only sort of major power that will join the United States in the Iraq War in 2003, whereas the rest of the world, good friends of America like Canada, Australia, Germany, will say no and advise America not to get involved in the war. But Britain was right there by their side. And World War I, World War II, America's going to be there helping Britain and the common interests that they have there. Okay, that concludes sort of foreign policy, 1890s up to 1914, when, of course, World War I breaks out. Thank you very much for listening.